Welcome to the Persuasive Mindset, your podcast guide to mastering the art of persuasion by exploring its role across diverse fields through a series of in-depth conversations with experts. I am your host, Dr. Serena Mate de Londra. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Adam Lupel, Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the International Peace Institute, an independent think tank based in New York City across from the United Nations. With a 50-year-long history of engaging with the United Nations agenda, IPI's work focuses on solving a broad range of global peace and security challenges. In this episode, Dr. Lupel reflects on his 18-year-long career at the IPI and shares insights on his transition from academia to policy work. He discusses the tension between academia's focus on theory and the policy world's need for actionable solutions, explaining how the IPI bridges these worlds by connecting research, policy, and practice. Dr. Lupel also emphasizes the critical role that persuasion plays in navigating today's polarized global environment by stating the following.
In general, in the political sphere or in anything today, it's a difficult time to think about persuasion in a classical sense because of polarization, because of the information marketplace. It almost seems like your classic tools for persuasion, rational argument, logos, pathos, even appeal to some sort of relevant authority, doesn't work anymore because everybody has their own bubble and everyone is kind of just looking for their own confirmation bias. So we're all kind of speaking to the like-minded as opposed to trying to actually persuade people that might think differently. So it's challenging in the international context, it's challenging in the national context, but I think it's even challenging just in sort of interpersonal relations in that way. And as a result, I think increasingly, and maybe this has always been the case, I think about it in terms of inside-outside. It's very difficult today to persuade somebody from the outside to say, I'm standing here, you're standing there, this is my perspective, agree with me. In order to really persuade somebody, you have to sort of get inside their perspective, understand how they're seeing things, and try to, in some way, effect a shift in how they see the world internally.
Additionally, Dr. Lupel discusses how the IPI bridges sectors, connecting actors across New York, Geneva, and beyond to address issues like peace building, inclusivity, climate change, and pandemic preparedness. He offers valuable advice to junior professionals on the importance of persistence, adaptability, and professionalism. This episode is rich with insights on persuasion, diplomacy, and career growth, offering a rare glimpse into the life of a leader at the intersection of academia and policy. Now, let's dive into our conversation with Dr. Adam Lupel. Enjoy! As we start our conversation, can you please briefly describe what is the International Peace Institute and why did you decide to work with them?
IPI, International Peace Institute, we're an independent, not-for-profit think tank based in New York City, right across the street from the United Nations. We have a 50-year history working on the United Nations agenda, historically focusing on UN peacekeeping, but over the course of the years broadening out our interests into a number of different areas. And we have 5 thematic programs. One broad umbrella program on revitalizing multilateral cooperation, one specifically on peacekeeping, Brian Urquhart Center for Peace Operations, which includes also sort of full spectrum peacekeeping, peace building, and mediation work. A dedicated program on women, peace, and security, and a big growing program on climate issues, and then some small work on humanitarian affairs and human rights. And I can say a little bit more about that in a moment, but when and why I joined a long time ago. I've been with IPI for 18 years, started in 2006 when I was finishing up my PhD. I was waiting to defend my dissertation, and at the time I was working as a editor managing a quarterly journal, and I joined the Institute as the editor, working on the publications. And to be honest, at the time, if you had told me that I was going to be still here 18 years later, I might have ran for the door, actually. At the time, I was really mostly on an academic track. But the work was fascinating and it kept me involved and growing, and I have not regretted it one day.
When transitioning from academia to the policy world, what are some examples of transferable skills you've noticed between the two fields?
From my own personal experience, I'll speak because I really wonder how good my experience transfers to others. So I was theorist. I was studying political theory at the New School for Social Research in New York, and I was studying globalization and challenges that globalization poses for democratic governance. But at the time, I was also working, as I mentioned, in academic publishing. So I came to IPI to work as an editor. And that skill set of understanding how to work with manuscripts and such transferred very well. What didn't, frankly, was the academic approach to writing versus what is the approach of policy writing. They're very different. And so that did take some time to develop that shift. But as you say, kind of the work ethic of being an academic and cultivating that determination and consistency of just sitting down and concentrating for long periods of time, I think transfers very, very well. And how to think through a problem is also a very important academic skill that transfers very, very well.
Staying with the same topic, I'm curious to know who were some of the key mentors who have helped you transition from academia to the policy world?
That's a good question. I mean, in some ways, I kind of threw myself into the deep end and had to figure things out myself. In other ways, there were some important people at the institution over the years that, if not mentors, were guides in some important ways and have since passed away. One was the late Ed Luck, who was a professor at Columbia, one of the great experts on the Security Council, and the first Assistant Secretary General Special Representative on the Responsibility to Protect, who worked at IPI in those early days that I was here. He was a predecessor of mine as vice president. And so he straddled that academic and policy work very, very well. And I think maybe in some ways, watching how he did that helped me. The other was the legendary Warren Hogue, who passed away just late last year. And he was a New York Times man, came to IPI after a legendary career at the New York Times. And so his ability to take complicated information and present it in a very readable way, I think was also an important lesson for me.
Can you share a brief example of a past project that highlights the differences between academic and policy approaches, which can allow you to then briefly explain how the IPI works?
This conversation about policy writing and academic writing makes me think of one old project, but it was a project that is pertinent to this conversation and that it provided lessons to me. And that in those early days, when I was making that transition from the academic world to the policy world, I engaged in this project on exploring transnational organized crime and peace operations. And I mention it because we gathered together in a workshop, a very diverse group of people that are working on the topic of transnational organized crime and peace operations. And we gathered together academics, researchers, policymakers that were working at headquarters in Geneva and in New York, and then field personnel. And I mention it because it's a project that has stayed in my mind for particular reason, and that is in the course of that workshop, and we're talking about this as many years ago, I realized those different sectors in the international community were talking past each other. And it wasn't just that they weren't kind of listening to each other, they were each asking very different questions. The academics were asking, what's the problem? Academics like to problematize things. The headquarter policymakers were saying, well, we know what the problem is. We want to know what to do about it. We're trying to craft policies about what to do about it. And the field personnel were saying, well, we know what the problem is and we know what to do about it, but we want to know how to do about it. We need to understand how we can have the capacity and the resources to do it. So everyone was talking about the same topic, but looking at it in very different ways. And in some respects, one of the roles of IPI as a think tank that bridges those kinds of communities is to present research policy recommendations that help to bridge those three questions. So also try to understand the problem, try to understand what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. And that carries through a lot of our work. But more sort of generally, all of IPI's work in those 5 programs that I mentioned has 3 pillars. We do research and we produce publications. We have events, some public, some private, and then we do sort of quiet diplomacy, quiet advising as well. And all of our work in trying to build that bridge between communities of different sectors asking different questions, we try to incorporate all 3 of those pillars as well in convening and advising.
Could you elaborate on IPI's role as a metaphorical bridge between Geneva and New York?
Well, I don't know if we're, the bridge, but we are trying to do some work to better bridge the institutions in Geneva and the institutions in New York, but also really the approaches. I mentioned earlier that one of the areas that we work on is humanitarian affairs. And another older project is relevant here in that we did some work on Security Council Resolution 2286, which is the resolution that reminds member states of their responsibilities to protect medical care workers in conflict zones. And when we first started doing that work in New York, we would bring people together and we would often get the response, well, that's a humanitarian issue. That should be discussed in Geneva. And this is going back about 10 years or so. But then as it became increasingly relevant in New York, we realized that the way those humanitarian topics were discussed in New York was very different than in Geneva. Geneva has more openness to civil society, has more field perspective, and New York is very political. But in order to address humanitarian issues in New York, you need to be able to incorporate those perspectives that you have in Geneva from civil society and the field perspective as well. So we try to provide that bridge by convening diverse groups of people and providing access to civil society voices, to high level or ambassadorial level, at least, discussions in New York, and in that way help to try to build both an openness to new kinds of thinking around some of these issues.
How does the IPI address peace and security topics in a holistic way, and why is it important to connect the various pillars of the United Nations system?
IPI is a peace and security organization, and we can see a trend over time in understanding the need to think holistically about peace and security. The Security Council historically has only considered its role to address questions of the maintenance of international peace and security related to hard security, armies, soldiers, war. But what you've seen in the last 10 years, as evidenced through the Sustainable Development Goals and other processes, is that in order to sustain peace over time, you have to think about more than just negative peace, the absence of war. You also have to think about what makes peace possible. And that includes sustainable development, that includes environmental policies, that includes a perspective on health. All that contributes to a more positive understanding of what the world needs in order to have peaceful societies. The only way to do that is to connect up the various pillars of the UN system. And those include the main pillars that we always talk about as peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights. But that's not all just headquartered in New York. Humanitarian issues are discussed in Geneva. The World Health Organization is based in Geneva. Tech issues have a headquarters in Geneva. So if we are to actually make progress in a more holistic understanding of these issues, we need to be able to connect up the various processes in the UN system in a more efficient and cooperative way.
Can you share some examples of recent IPI projects that demonstrate its role in addressing global challenges?
Two recent projects that are the best examples of that. One is our work on climate change. So IPI in the last 4 years has been actively involved in the process around the climate negotiations through the COP. And in particular, we've been part of the delegation at the last two COPs of the Maldives. And so we've been advising the government of the Maldives on their work to establish the loss and damage fund as part of the COP process. So this is the funding that will go to developing countries that have experienced material and other losses due to climate change. And this effort was led by the small island developing states. And IPI was working very closely, kind of behind the scenes, with the Maldives to help with this process. And then the second area would be actually relevant to Geneva, is our work in the INB process to establish a new international instrument for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. As you may have read, it was supposed to be approved at the World Health Assembly, wasn't able to be done so because of pretty dramatic divisions around questions of equity. And so IPI in the last few months has been quietly convening informal meetings in Geneva to help try to bridge some of the divisions around these questions, working with Costa Rica and also a broad group of member states in Geneva.
Shifting towards the overall topic of career trajectory and growth, how did you initially become interested in the field of international relations?
How I got into the IR field goes way back in the sense of my university days. I entered university with no idea what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to understand how the world works because I didn't understand the world. And so I started as a college student just taking international relations courses in part because I had an itch to understand how the world worked. Not because I thought to myself, oh, I want to work in international affairs, but because I had questions that I was curious about. And when I finished university, I ended up studying, getting a degree in international relations with a focus on Latin America because I was studying Spanish as well. When I finished university, I kind of ironically wanted to get far away from the formal IR kind of field, and I wanted to get my hands dirty. And so I did some volunteer work in Nicaragua. And this is going to date myself. We're talking about this is late 92, 93. And we did what now you would call micro development. I worked in the field in a small village with a group called the Institute for International Cooperation and Development. And I worked on a small kind of project working with what today we would call IDPs, internally displaced people, but that we didn't have that nomenclature back then. And so I wanted to understand both how the world works and what are the consequences of big powers, policies in the ground. You know, back in those days, Central America had just come out of the big wars of the 90s, which was a big topic of debate in the United States and around the world in the late 80s and early 90s. But I wasn't necessarily certain that I wanted to work in IR. And then when I came home after that year working in the field, I still had questions. And I knew that I wanted to learn more. And so I ended up applying to graduate schools, mostly because I had those questions in my mind that I just was driving me. And I wanted to spend some time reading. And that's how I ended up getting more on the academic track, but again, with an interest in the world and how the world works. and how the world is changing. And so I guess thinking about it, the real answer to that question is I never really said to myself, okay, this is the work that I want to do, but I was driven by questions that I wanted to pursue and curiosity in some way. And that led me to where I am.
Based on your work experience, what are your thoughts on the role of persuasion in today's polarized world and on your overall work within the field of international relations?
It's an interesting question. It's a very difficult time today, I think. In general, in the political sphere or in anything today, I think it's a difficult time to think about persuasion in a classical sense. It's very difficult because of polarization, because of the information marketplace. It almost seems like your classic tools for persuasion, rational argument, the classic rhetoric, logos, pathos, even appeal to some sort of relevant authority doesn't work anymore because everybody has their own bubble and everyone is kind of just looking for their own confirmation bias. So we're all kind of speaking to the like-minded as opposed to trying to actually persuade people that might think differently. So it's challenging in the international context, it's challenging in the sort of national context, but I think it's even challenging just in sort of interpersonal relations in that way. And as a result, I think increasingly, and maybe this has always been the case, I think about it in terms of inside outside. It's very difficult today to persuade somebody from the outside to say, I'm standing here, you're standing there, this is my perspective, agree with me. You have to, in order to really persuade somebody, you have to sort of get inside their perspective, understand how they're seeing things, and try to, in some way, effect a shift in how they see the world internally. And that's not an easy thing to do. Sometimes even just making the effort to do that can build trust and build the ground in order to shift mindsets to persuade. Nationally, I think you're seeing that out in debates around Ukraine and Gaza and the transformation of the international system as a whole. I think this sort of came up in the early debates around Ukraine when the North Atlantic community, the US and Europe, were very surprised that the African member states weren't immediately on the side of the US and Europe against Russia. And they took the perspective of join us, otherwise you're either with us or against us. And that was a big mistake because the African member states and even member states like Brazil or India, independent powers, have a very different perspective on these things. And there was no real attempt to see things from their perspective, as opposed to just say, we're in this fight with Russia, you should join us, and if you don't join us, you're against us, as opposed to understand the interests of those countries. And so I think there's been a shift, a better attempt to kind of begin to understand the independent positions of those member states, but not a complete shift. And I think that in order to persuade, you have to do that. You have to sort of take that step of saying, what is the perspective, what is the position of the person I'm trying, or the member state or the government that I'm trying to persuade, and work from there as opposed to your own stance.
Over time, how has women's participation in multilateral institutions evolved, and what challenges do you believe still exist in achieving gender equality in leadership positions?
It's interesting because one of the projects at IPI, I kind of have talked about old projects, but one of our current projects that we've been engaged in is something called the Multilateralism Index. And I actually have on my desk the most recent version or the draft that will come out in the fall. And what the Multilateralism Index does in part is measuring inclusion of women in the multilateral system. The index measures participation, performance, and inclusivity across 5 domains: peace and security, human rights, global public health, trade, and the environment. And one of the common trends is the increase in participation of women in multilateral institutions. That's a good thing. However, that trend is not sharp enough to correct for all the inequalities over the decades, in particular in senior leadership positions. So there is more inclusion of women in multilateral institutions, but not enough. In just sort of anecdotally, at IPI, we've been a very open organization for as long as I have been here. I have many senior colleagues that are women. To me, it's such an obvious thing that this can't be a male-dominated space.
Based on IPI's work portfolio, what trends have you observed in incorporating a gender perspective within multilateral institutions, and what challenges do you foresee moving forward?
I think that at IPI, our commitment to providing a gender perspective on everything that we do is very important to us, in that we have a dedicated program on women, peace, and security. But that team has two roles. It is to provide research and programming on the topic of women, peace, and security as it relates to the Security Council and other issues related to gender security, but also they're tasked with helping us to provide a gender perspective on everything that we do. And that's something that has been an institutional commitment at IPIs. And I think it's something that we've led on, but also it's something that, you asked about trends. It's something that we've been also increasingly asked to do. So over the 15 years that I've been here, there's definitely been a greater awareness of these issues. At the same time, I think there's a real risk that we're also in a moment of backlash, that the progress on gender issues is by no means guaranteed to continue, and we need to be vigilant about that.
What excites you the most about working within the field of international peace, especially given the current challenges? And what does a typical day look like for you?
What am I excited about in my field? Well, I don't know if this is necessarily a positive note because I work at a peace institute, a national peace institute. When you ask me about my day, my day is so varied because I work in management and as well as research, and I'm working with people a lot. So it's hard to say what my typical day is, but I work at a peace institute, and I often get the quip when I say I work at the International Peace Institute. People often say, "Oh, well, that's not going very well." And it's true. The international peace and security environment is very difficult presently. And on the one hand, I often say, in the same way that only, a doctor can enjoy a good pathology, I find the complexity of the world very interesting and exciting because the world is changing, and change provides opportunity to have an impact on the direction of change. So whereas I think a lot of people are seeing growing disorder, and that's can be very scary, I see opportunity to affect change for a more positive and peaceful future.
And on that positive note, as we conclude our conversation, what advice would you like to give to junior professionals aiming for a career similar to yours?
Well, I get asked this question often about how did you come to be here? And I don't know. I, I don't, nothing happens according to plan. And I think one has to recognize that kind of going back to what I was saying about how I got here, in part by pursuing interests. And so I think in terms of career trajectory, it's always important to not, to me, unless you want to be a doctor or a lawyer or something that has a real concrete professional track. I think it's important to not necessarily pursue what you think is the job, but rather the interest and expertise, and then the job will follow. I was given advice very early on that I think I didn't realize how important it was until much later. And that was cultivate a sense of professionalism in anything that you do. And I think that's really good advice. Be a professional no matter what kind of task you're doing. Don't save that professionalism for the top task that you think is what you're doing. When I first came on to IPI, as I said, I was an academic. I wasn't driving to be part of the policy space. And I came into this office environment, and part of me said, I don't know what I'm doing. And I was given a series of tasks. I remember first I had to write some sort of memo. And I didn't really know what I was doing, but I told myself I want to do this as professionally as possible. One of the other tasks that I was given I was the editor and publications officer, and I had the responsibility of organizing our library. And literally just sort of, the books were a mess, and I was responsible for making it, or I took the responsibility because the library was in my domain, and I thought this is a mess, and I'm going to clean it up. And I actually committed myself to learning the Dewey Decimal System, and I just threw myself into actually organizing the library. No one told me to do that, but I said to myself, I want to be a professional at whatever task or responsibility I'm given. And I think that's served me well. And I try to give the advice to young professionals, don't reserve that commitment to what you think are the tasks that are most important. Be professional in every task, major or minor, and cultivate a reputation for getting things done. That being said, don't just be satisfied with those mundane tasks. Be ready when opportunity to advance, when that door opens, and be ready to jump, because that door doesn't always stay open. And so you've got to always be kind of prepared to jump when the occasion strikes.
And that concludes our conversation with Dr. Adam Lupel. If you enjoyed this discussion, please be sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this episode with others who might benefit from it. Until next time, be well.